All right, I'm sure a few more people will join, but let us not while away the hour on waiting. Let us welcome to Friday and to another webinar organized by the Recipes Network. Recipes stands for Resilient, Equitable, and Circular Innovations with Partnership and Education Synergies. And we're funded through the National Science Foundation's Sustainable Regional Systems Networks program. Our team of more than 40 researchers from 15 different institutions and multiple non-academic partners is working across the food system to advance the science needed to make our wasteful food system sustainable, equitable, and resilient. Now, we're excited for this webinar. Just some quick reminders, webinar protocol, please mute your microphones and feel free to drop questions into the chat. We are recording, and this will be available later. So, and we'll send out to all of you links to that at a particular point. And for accessibility reasons, this meeting has closed captioning as well. Well, we are delighted to have several researchers from our network today who are focusing on understanding how we might help consumers waste less food in their daily lives. Given that waste is at all these consumer-focused points in our food supply chain, we're thinking residences, food service settings, retail food settings, that waste that's consumer adjacent constitutes a majority of wasted food in the United States. And getting knowledge about how to reduce that is critical to the efforts to reduce overall food waste. Now, our two groups are taking very different vantage points to this question, with Gwen Balto and Melissa Prescott working to assemble the best hacks and tips provided by those who self-identify as people who are really good at converting their food into nutrition. Now, in contrast, later we'll hear from our group from Pennington Biomedical Research Center, and they are helping us to kind of walk in the shoes of regular consumers. Each of them has worked as interventionists tasked with helping regular consumers reduce their food waste while also maintaining or improving their nutrition. So without further ado, I will turn the screen over to Gwen and Melissa to enlighten us about the behavior of these so-called food conservers. So take it away, Gwen and Melissa.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian. Happy Friday, everyone. I want to thank Brian and the Recipes team for giving Gwen and I the opportunity to share our research with you all. So the title of our presentation is Learning What Works, How Food Conservers Prevent Waste. So Brian already gave an overview of the magnitude of the food waste problem, and I'll build on that by summarizing some of the main drivers of household waste. So I'll start with good provider identity. This refers to the desire to be viewed as a gracious host or a good parent by never running out of food and having a variety of food options available for our guests and children. And this is, of course, associated with overbuying and waste, and it's particularly relevant this time of year. Eating norms can also promote waste. Generally, Americans have negative feelings towards leftovers and have some general bias towards wanting to eat only the freshest foods possible. And then social and temporal obligations are also major waste determinants. People often purchase food with the intention of cooking it, but then life happens and they're no longer able to prepare the purchased food. And these time and scheduling challenges are very difficult for most households to juggle. And then finally, many people have poor food literacy, meaning they lack key knowledge and skills and this prevents them from using their food resources efficiently. So in particular, gaps in knowledge about how to best store food and when food is no longer safe to eat are particularly problematic. So I was very inspired by the 2015 study by Ronnie Neff and her colleagues, where they did this nationally representative study on food waste attitudes and behaviors. They found that a third of Americans put a lot of effort into reducing waste. And I became really interested, what are these people doing to conserve food and prevent waste? And because if they're doing something that works, wouldn't it be great if we could learn from them and figure out what might work for other people as well? So in public health, we refer to this approach as a positive deviance approach, which is basically just the process of studying the uncommon but beneficial behaviors utilized by the minority in an effort to scale those up to the masses. So this led us to our study on studying self-identified food conservers. So in this study, we actually collected the data about a year ago. What we'll be mainly talking about today are what we learned from the online focus groups that we did. And so in order to be eligible to participate, people had to identify themselves as food conservers. And then also they had to be responsible for their own food procurement. So we didn't allow people who are participating on any kind of like campus meal plan to participate. And so our discussions focused on motivations for food conservation, strategies being utilized to mitigate waste, as well as barriers. So we did a hybrid inductive deductive thematic analysis with 3 independent coders, and we reached data saturation with 27 participants. So we paired this data with survey data. We asked participants to track their food waste for a week using the protocol by Koskin et al. And we also asked them a series of questions about their food-related behaviors, attitudes, as well as some demographic information.
Okay, so now we will discuss some of the findings from both the focus group and the survey. So overall, we estimate that the majority of our sample were in fact food conservers, and I'll briefly describe how we came to this conclusion. So first, we evaluated the food waste estimations. Koskin et al. Utilized the same waste measurement method as us, and they categorized their participants into 4 groups depending on their reported waste. Conservers and considerates are 2 of the 4 categories associated with the lowest amount of waste, and 25 of the 27 participants of our sample fell into these 2 categories. Second, the respondents of our group reported high intention to avoid waste. Intention to avoid waste has been recognized as a significant factor associated with lower production of household food waste. And then our participants also had high levels of perceived behavioral control. This element is strongly correlated to health behavior performances in general, as well as lower levels of waste generation. When the participants were asked about what barriers they might face, they didn't have too much to report on their own end, but rather they discussed why other people might struggle to reduce food waste. And this really reflects their competence and autonomy to conserve food. Our sample also demonstrated really active engagement in household behaviors such as shopping, planning, and food preparation routines, specifically that are known to lessen the amount of food waste produced. So engagement throughout the entire food journey ultimately allows for a more efficient, less wasteful process. And finally, we found that both participants in this study and those of other studies associated with lower waste production have a similar motivation of thinking from a humanitarian and moral imperative perspective. So what this means is that a main driver for participants not to waste is having this consciousness that there are other people struggling with food security and that this internal value increases their efforts towards waste reduction. So we asked participants to describe what strategies they employ to reduce waste in their household, and they responded with a variety of methods that fall into different phases of the food management continuum. So we have meal planning, food procurement, which includes shopping, hunting, gardening, food storage and preservation, food preparation, serving and consumption, and disposal. Now, the arrows that we have between each of these phases is important is because there's a flow to this process. The methods employed at one phase impacts the steps taken at the next. So while we were analyzing all the strategies within these phases, there were 2 prominent themes that emerged, which included proactive measures and adaptive recovery measures. Within our study, we also investigated 4 main domains that impact waste production on the individual level. And the first being attitudes and the resulting behaviors. We then have demographic and socioeconomic factors. We also looked at skills and traits. So the skills include improvisational cooking, food literacy, and then the traits are resiliency, organization, and adaptability. And then finally, when we ask participants, like, what motivates you to reduce your waste? The main motivations, we had 2 internal and 2 external. So the internal ones were culture and family upbringing, humanitarian and moral imperative, as well as extrinsic motivations of labor supply chain appreciation and financial benefit. And all of these things together ultimately resulted in food waste prevention.
So we have 4 main themes that we want to emphasize today in terms of the the strategies people are using. The first one is an experimentation mindset. So a participant quote, "Along the way, there are some hits and misses, but that's how life is. You learn and you get better over time." And so this was one thing that our population had in common, this learning mindset. And anytime they cooked something that didn't go well, or they did experience waste, they had a mindset of understanding that food's not always going to be perfect. And they used these opportunities to learn and get better and improve their capacity to reduce waste. And then the second one was organizing for visibility. This is one of my favorite quotes. One participant said, "I think we operate very visually on food. If you can see it, you can dream it, and then you can eat it." So participants talked about using clear containers to store food, using shallow depth storage methods or lazy Susans, different ways to prevent food from being pushed back to the back of the refrigerator or the back of the cabinet and being forgotten about. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then another huge one was love your leftovers. So one participant said, we have lots of ways of creating a new dish out of the leftovers. So we are just not reheating it up and serving the old food. And so the majority of our participants took the approach of transforming leftover food into something new and exciting, where there was a minority that took a more pragmatic approach of just having a house policy to where we are never going to buy food for lunch. We are always going to force ourselves to reuse the food from other meals to take care of our lunch food. And then the last one is utilizing aging food. Participant quote, "Vegetables that have started to go a little softer are still going to be completely fine in a stew, a bake, or something, even if you wouldn't eat it raw." So again, this is an example of this improvisational cooking, of cooking what you have on hand, but in particular, prioritizing aging items first, or things that are prematurely starting to ripe, unexpectedly switching around your plans to make sure that those foods are prioritized.
So especially as we move into this holiday season, we wanted to share some direct applications of both the proactive and adaptive recovery methods reported by our participants. So while menu planning, resisting provider identity urges would involve cutting down the menu for not only the realistic number of people, but also the realistic amount of food consumed, rather than trying to tend to every potential want of each guest. And then also during this phase, prioritization of aging food should be incorporated into your plans. During procurement or shopping, checking inventories prior to shopping is such an important proactive element. It prevents you from buying items you may already have and forgetting about items that are going to spoil soon. Trying to resist and avoid sales is pretty difficult, but a general rule of thumb is that prices that end with 99 cents are usually not that great of a sale. If you do happen to overbuy, freeze what you can. There are so many items, including produce, baked goods, meat, and candies that can be frozen without compromising the integrity of the product. And then during food preparation, try to minimize the trim from produce or use them in other ways. Broccoli stems can be chopped and sauteed, potato skins can be served as appetizers, and then the trim from other produce is always great for stock. Meals made with separate components can be repurposed and recreated into other dishes, or it can be frozen as is. And then for food storage, we talk about the freezer a lot, and proactive measures include dividing the food into smaller portions to preserve quality and labeling to prevent things from getting lost. Maximizing visibility also prevents things from getting pushed to the back and forgotten about, and also encourages consumption. For adaptive recovery, food literacy is an important component here. Knowing little tips such as using spoiled milk as buttermilk in baking can take you a long way. And then during consumption, the biggest proactive element is reducing the amount originally portioned. Plate waste is positively correlated with the initial portion taken. So by reducing the initial portion taken, you can reduce the amount of plate waste. Serving less also allows you to freeze more leftovers. And then sharing excess with neighbors, friends, and family is also a great option. In terms of disposal, all of the elements discussed before this are proactive from keeping things from being thrown away. But some other options include donation for unwanted shelf-stable goods, and some people even mention feeding to household animals as appropriate.
So Gwen shared a variety of hacks and tips that we gleaned from our data, but the big picture message is that there's no one hack that's going to work for everyone. Other research has shown that food waste is a result of a series of decisions interplayed with attitudes and knowledge across the food management continuum, but which our data also supports. But what we learned in this study is that in each phase of the continuum, there are proactive preventative measures that one can take to make sure you're not bringing too much food into the home, that you maintain the quality and safety of the food that you do bring in as long as possible, and that you make it as realistic as possible for you to eat the food that you purchase. But food will go bad eventually, and even the consumers in our sample had to pair these proactive measures with these adaptive recovery measures in order to mitigate waste. And so the four main tips that we hope you'll adopt for your households are adopting this experimentation mindset, organizing for visibility, love your leftovers, and utilize aging food first.
So from all the findings of the study, we also developed a survey to assess the home food environment and waste-related behaviors and food literacy. And we're looking for about 25 more participants for our survey validation study. If you are interested, participants are asked to test one section of the survey and participate in a brief online interview. You can feel free to email us or scan the QR code for an eligibility survey. Participants are compensated with a $20 electronic gift card, and we appreciate all the feedback provided.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention today. And here's our contact information. We're happy to get in touch with anyone who's interested.
Wow, that was great. I love that graphic. Several of the graphics you put forward, and the proactive versus adaptive, I think, is a great way to kind of really slice up this literature, and glad you guys have kind of put some names on that. Some questions coming in through the chat. I'll summarize for you. A lot of people interested in the demographics of your group, and if you did find, and I know this is not the primary purpose of your study, but if there were any nascent trends about which groups, which profiles might have been more likely to be in this group.
So Gwen, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so some of the major demographics that we found were the age range was between 30 and 50 years old. Most of our participants were female, white, or Asian. And then majority of them came from higher education background, and that kind of has to do with our recruitment strategy because we were on campus during that time. From the literature of what I found, most participants in these studies tend to be female because females tend to take on that food responsibility role in most households. And then there's still inconsistent findings with the demographic of income on household food waste, but some believe that like higher income leads to more food coming into the home. And if you don't have the management skills to do that, then it leads to higher waste. And yeah, those were the main demographics of our sample.
And we did find that that it was very prevalent in our sample that people as children had experiences with food insecurity, or their parents had experiences when they were children of food insecurity, but the people in our sample were not food insecure overall.
Interesting. That's an interesting legacy issue. Oh, wow, intergenerational. Some other questions that pop up here. Some typical mitigators or propagators of waste. Date labels. Was there any talk of date labels? And what was the other one? I'll get back to the other one in a second. But any mention of date labels by this group?
I'll take this one. So people mention date labels as a problem for other people, but not for them. So people in our sample relied on sensory cues to determine when food was waste, and they really were proactive about, using aging food first. And so they did not have an issue, but they recognized that might be an issue for others.
Any sense that they were treading onto dangerous territory, that they were taking any food safety issues, that they were kind of pushing that boundary, or not?
No, it didn't. It did not seem. Again, this like experimentation mindset, which I know can sound dangerous, but I think historically through time, humans did not use date labels. So I think we have the capacity to do it. It's just a matter of teaching people what they need to know.
Got it. The other kind of mitigator, time pressure. Were these folks, did they talk about time pressure being an issue, or did they not have it, or did they figure out a way to get around it?
So they brought up time and they talked about the strategies that they use. So I'll mention some that I remember, and Gwen, feel free to jump in. But you know, this idea of carving out time to plan and carving out time to discuss with other people in their family what schedule things were going to happen. And again, that's part of the proactive part of the continuum. But then when changes came up, they were, you know, putting things into the freezer and being ready, being kind of nimble and ready for those like inevitable changes that are going to occur.
Got it. Okay. Any mention of composting interactions here? These typical composters as well. What's the sense on that?
So again, these people were not wasting very much. They didn't have very much to compost. And so they were probably like the, you know, the super conservers that tried to like use their peels to make new things. And so they did mention composting, but that was not their primary strategy.
Is your sense that promoting composting would not be fruitful? Or I mean, there's always that tension, and we've seen a few documentations of if you provide composting or encourage composting, does that then encourage waste as well? What's your sense on that tension here?
Well, the visibility, we did learn from this sample about how important visibility is. And so I think, you know, composting can help with that visibility when you see how much you're throwing, you know, you're wasting. But in terms of a long-term solution, it doesn't seem like it's the best long-term solution. But it should be paired with some of these proactive and reactive strategies that we mentioned.
And one last question, I think, from the chat here. How do people maximize the visibility of their foods, keeping it from that dreaded back green corner of the fridge? You mentioned the lazy Susan. What are some other ways?
Gwen, you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of participants talked about like keeping a very shallow depth fridge, so only like 4 to 5 items. Our fridges, you know, as they get bigger, again, this is very dependent on what your fridge capacity is, but if you can keep it as shallow as possible, that's ideal. And yeah, I think that was one of the major things.
Yeah. And someone else talked about, like, they refer to it as container play. And so like when you eat, like redoing your containers and like pairing things together that, you know, maybe you didn't cook together, but could go together when you're doing your leftovers, and just like having a tight, you know, a relationship with your fridge of like, you know, using it a lot and not just putting it in there and forgetting it.
Awesome. Wow, this has been fascinating. We'll get to, there's a couple more questions, but for sake of time, let us maybe move on over to our next group who'll be presenting. And I'm going to share the slides for that group. Let me find those quickly. Sorry for the delay. And this is from the Pennington group. Can everybody see this? Let me try to get.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome. Get this blown up a bit. Great. Well, that was an excellent presentation. We're looking forward to hearing now from our dietitians as food waste reduction coaches. Mary Catherine Francis, Isabelle Schexnayder, and Malindi Vink will be sharing their thoughts with us. Just a little background on the study that kind of helped formulate this. There are a couple of studies go by the names of Food Image 1 and Food Image 2 that they'll talk about today. The purpose of these studies, funded through USDA, was to test an app that we had created to help measure food waste in-home in situations. And so there was a lab phase 1, but in phase 2, this was a free living intervention. Each participant had an intro visit. There's some baseline data collection with the app. There's a week of break. And then an interventionist would visit with them. And then there'd be a follow-up data collection of about a week, a little less sometimes. And then an exit survey as well. Participants were randomized in either to a stress management group, which was kind of our control group, or the food waste reduction intervention group. Nudges were administered through the app, and support intervention was provided as needed through emails, phone calls, and text messages by our panelists today. The summary of some of this from this first study was that during this week, there was a great reduction in plate waste. And these are data that were shared through a recent article in Resources Conservation and Recycling. There was also a small reduction in the amount of food selected and the amount of food consumed, mainly carbohydrates, and no changes in some things that happen less frequently, such as clean out waste and food prep waste. This is now a follow-up study is going on right now with 46 individuals. All the data has been collected. The interventions have just been completed. Each participant received 3 intervention sessions with behavioral nudges. They're also provided with boxes of fruits and vegetables equal to about 60% of their household needs over that time. And again, this was a randomized controlled trial where there was a control group as well. And so the interventionists really worked with individuals to reduce food waste and also were consistent with many weight management and health improvement recommendations. What we want to do now, though, is talk with our interventionists about the strategies they used in terms of some of them are listed here on this page, encouraging the smart use of existing foods, educating people on smart shopping around their existing foods, prioritizing fruits and veggies as they spoil first, some themes that we can remember from the earlier presentation, and suggested participants prepare produce right away, freeze and store appropriately. So again, trying to transfer some of those ideas from our first group. And then customizable goal setting were used to try to help individuals adhere to some of these aspirational goals that were set with our interventionists. They also encourage family involvements, especially with large households with kids, emphasizing the monetary savings that could be part of this, discussing creative ways to incorporate veggies into their meals, in particular, introducing new recipes, addressing any space limitations that they might have, and then addressing any false or unrealistic beliefs, and composting being mentioned here. But I'd like to bring forward our interventionists here. And let me pull up my questions. We'll treat this as a panel and have folks talk about this. So I don't know what order you guys want to go in, but if you would kind of walk us through kind of the mindset of your participants as they began their kind of intervention time with you. Were there any like preconceived notions or kind of ideas that really had to be challenged? Who wants to go first? Mary Catherine, maybe, and then we can work our way around the windows.
Yeah, sure thing. So specifically with this study, we did do a screening interview to make sure that our participants were going to be able to properly complete all study protocols. So they came into their first visit kind of with a little bit of an awareness of maybe not specifically what we were going to talk about, but maybe some things that were going to be asked of them. So everyone who came in was eager. We did have some participants that we screened who were not excited, not eager, but typically those didn't make it through the screening process. But I had a lot of participants who were just very, very eager to kind of be sponges in our intervention. I think in recent years, people have become more aware of food waste as a kind of global issue and as a household issue. So a lot of my participants were very eager. I will say I did have a couple participants who wanted to be eager, but were a little bit more stuck in their ways and struggled with openness to the intervention.
Interesting. Isabelle, how about you?
Yeah, I agree that a lot of my food waste participants did start out very optimistic. They were excited to learn about food waste and to learn about improving their nutrition. I would say I did have a few participants feel overwhelmed because they were receiving boxes of fruits and vegetables. And typically it was a lot more than they would generally eat on a normal basis. So some of them would just feel overwhelmed in that respect, having to cook that extra food and figure out what to do with it. But yeah, I do agree with Mary Catherine that a lot of them were very optimistic to start.
Yeah, in the recruitment ads, we talked about how they would get the boxes of fruit and vegetables. And so most people, they were drawn in by that and were really excited about that. But as Isabelle mentioned, we would calculate out 60% of their household needs. And often it was a lot more than they expected, especially if it was a larger family. We had some study participants who had multiple teenage kids who had high caloric needs. And so we would end up, at the visit, sending them with 2 or 3 big boxes of produce. And so that was exciting, but also sometimes maybe a little bit overwhelming.
Interesting. I suppose, yeah, 5 a day, and they were expecting maybe 3 a day might have been their norm. And so they got the additional, and they're probably overwhelmed by that. Wow. So kind of when you did your intake interviews and kind of the first parts were coming together with the folks who you were interacting with, how did you kind of assess the circumstances of their living situation, kind of try to identify kind of best starting points? Were there common issues faced by people, or was it pretty much case by case?
Yeah, so one of the greatest tools that we had in this study to help assess kind of people's baseline needs and kind of baseline practices was the at-home inventory. So we did a teens call where we recorded them taking us through their fridge, their pantry, their freezer. And that was a very true testament to how they use food in their household. So I would say for me, that was kind of the biggest tool that I had to kind of formulate how aggressive I was going to be, or what strategies I was going to use. Some common kind of themes that I saw during that inventory were either people had absolutely nothing and they lived a very bare bones kind of life, which was pretty easy. Those were probably our easiest participants because we just had to help them figure out what they needed to do with what they were receiving in their boxes. The more difficult side of things were people that had extra freezers. So maybe freezers in their garage, or, the deep freezes that, like the chest freezers. Our participants that had those freezers that are out in a different part of their house or a different part of their property, a lot of them didn't realize things that were in those freezers. And so we had to not only help them figure out how to use their fresh produce, but find a way for them to use the stuff in those freezers as well. So I would say that was probably one of the most surprising things that I found in those inventories when I was kind of formulating my plan of action with each participant.
I agree that it seemed like we had the extremes, either people kept nothing in their pantry or they kept everything in their pantry that they could eat off of for years. But I think
there dietary differences. I'm just fascinated. You guys are all dietitians. Did it seem like was that correlated with kind of a healthiness of their were the empty fridge folks just eating all processed items that were shelf stable? What's your sense?
No, I would say the people who I experienced with very little kept in their pantries, fridges, were more likely to eat fresh produce than the people who just kept stockpiles of canned foods in their pantry. That was my experience, at least.
Yeah, earlier they mentioned sales and how it can be a good thing to save money, but then people might stock up. And we would definitely see that sometimes where somebody would start the intervention with 18 cans of tomatoes in their freezer or in the pantry because it was on sale. And so, we would do those inventories at the beginning and the end of the study to kind of get a sense of, were they eating some of what they already had in addition to what we were giving them, and just sort of looking at pre and post. But, some people would have an extra refrigerator and they would have, game meat from hunting. And so that was kind of a healthy lifestyle choice maybe. But in other cases, it might be, a large family, people are buying things, not realizing what they already have. And so it would be more of a kind of, older mismatch, and maybe some things were freezer burned and had to be thrown away. So yeah, I think people that had more space, sometimes it could be more of a challenge.
And just to note, these are all folks from the Baton Rouge, Louisiana metropolitan area. So just for context for folks there. So did you think you had any of Melissa and Gwen's group in there? Did you have any True Blue food conservers who are in your group? And if so, what kind of proportion?
Isabelle definitely had one. So I think I'm going to pass the torch to her to talk about her really good participant.
Yeah, so I would say starting out in the study, it was definitely more challenging to counsel those individuals who had children, especially young children. And so one of my success stories would be this single mom who, was raising I think she was a 9-year-old little girl who had a tendency to be a little picky. And so we worked on, getting her involved in the prep of the fresh fruits and vegetables, which made her much more likely to, actually eat them. So she would get excited about, being able to cook the food, cut up the food with her mom within reason. And then, she would help decide what foods they were going to make with the fruits and vegetables that they were giving. So she just would get really excited about eating it. And she would definitely, her mom reported she would try more things than she had in the past. With that, they obviously did have some waste, but so these people lived closer to New Orleans, and they found a local composting service. And so at the end of the day, they would go on their little evening walk to the composting service in their neighborhood and compost all those little bits and pieces of inedible produce that, that they had just not used in the preparation, or that the little girl, didn't like or something. So, but that was definitely successful.
Yeah, we definitely had some people who entered the study already very cognizant. And so sometimes, we would be looking at baseline data for them, and it was like, you're already doing a really great job. You're barely wasting anything, which was awesome to see. But so for them, sometimes the goals would get really specific. And people would really want to get creative about using, bits and bobs and peels and things like that, because they were already starting off so aware of it. And so by the end, they didn't want to waste anything.
Wow. What about the other end of the spectrum? We've got the food conservers who might have been fit into Melissa and Gwen's group. What about those who were on the other end of the spectrum and wasting a lot? How did their progress come out over the intervention?
I would say for the majority of our people who maybe had a lot more of us, a lot more that we could work with, most of them were very open and engaged in the intervention, and we were able to see improvements in their food waste behaviors. I can think of a specific example that I have of a young man and his wife who were eating just mostly fast food for every meal. When we started baseline, a few vegetables, not as many fruits, like a banana for the wife, but he wasn't really eating much fruit. And most of his vegetables were frozen, kind of the type of vegetable covered in a cheese sauce. So, working with him, it was a lot of me asking him to try raspberries, to try strawberries, to try blackberries. And, there were some things that he really didn't like the blackberries, the seeds he didn't really enjoy that. But then he discovered he loved blueberries. And so, we would work and find ways that he could incorporate blueberries, and he tried different preparation styles of vegetables. He was very open to preparing the fruits and vegetables in a fun way. It was just getting him to try them. And once he was trying them, I found that he was really successful at using everything we gave him. And I especially encouraged him to freeze fruits, especially those berries he didn't like, because you can throw that into a smoothie and it can taste more like blueberries than it does blackberries. But over time, he would use all the blackberries that we gave him by putting them in a smoothie. So
Yeah, the boxes were designed loosely around what the participants liked. So if from the beginning in screening, somebody said, I won't eat anything green, I'm allergic to potatoes, if there was a high number like that, then they may have been excluded. But once they were in the study, we would try to work with them. You know, everybody has preferences, but we would also ask them to try new things. And so sometimes you would get people who would enter the study pretty picky, but you know, they wouldn't necessarily have tried sunchokes or leeks or, you know, passion fruit. And so they discovered new foods that they liked. And so that was great because, you know, they found something good, it wasn't wasted. And they also like left the study with a new appreciation. So that was always nice to
Malindi,
see.
that's really interesting because we heard Melissa and Gwen talk about experimental mindset in terms of food preparation. Do you think that carries over to kind of food palate as well?
Well, I think, you know, especially as people get older, sometimes you maybe get a little bit stuck in your ways. Like MC mentioned, if you're used to buying fast food, like we all kind of form habits. And so in some ways, what was nice about this intervention was that, you know, we were giving them more than they expected, maybe something they didn't usually cook. And so it kind of forced people to take an extra second to think about their food preparation, to try something new. And we would give them recipes and, you know, try to be helpful about how to store and cook food. But yeah, I think that kind of the novelty of it and the added layer of accountability, knowing that they would see you the next week and you would say, okay, great. So how did you end up using that? I think that helped people to kind of embrace the intervention and, you know, maybe grow a little bit in terms of what they're cooking and eating and doing.
Yeah, and definitely. We did a lot of prep work for the coming week at each session to say like, okay, these are the fruits and vegetables you're receiving. So how are we going to plan to use that this week? So just doing that, preparing ahead, I think helped a lot.
Nice. Well, what about the other end? We talked about some successes here. Were there just some things that just didn't fly? Some people who just wouldn't budge? What are your kind of fails here, if you will?
yeah, I had one person who really struggled. Anything I suggested, she wasn't really into. She was a more kind of overwhelmed, stressed out type of personality. And so a lot of times I'd say, like, would you be willing to try doing this, or, you know, prepping this, like setting 2 hours aside on this particular day to prep these fruits or vegetables? And she would maybe agree, but then when I checked in with her, it didn't always happen. And I found that, you know, for some of our participants, having that couple hours to prepare all the fruits and vegetables that they were receiving was really helpful. But for others, that was kind of a fail. And they, you know, wouldn't take that time to do the preparation. And kind of the same goes for inventories. Some of our participants were very receptive to making like their own inventory, kind of like what we did on the Microsoft Teams call, but something kind of that had their own ownership that they were kind of responsible for. And I found that for some people it worked really, really well, but for a lot of people, keeping up with that was very overwhelming and a bigger task than the average person has time for in their week for.
Yeah, I think that, like I said, the participants who had children were a bit more challenging, and especially our larger households. I noticed that they were just getting so many fruits and vegetables because we were providing 60% of their household's needs. They were just, you know, they got busy throughout the week, you know, they had to stay late at work, whatever. Maybe their kid had like baseball practice or like dance or whatever after, and then the preparation just wouldn't get done in those instances. And they would have so much to prepare that there'd be a lot left over at the end of the week.
Yeah, we collected data based on household. And so, you know, the main participant may have been pretty engaged. And we also had some participants who were, single, lived alone. And so for them, it was really straightforward. Like, this is for me, either I'm eating it or no one is. But I had a couple participants whose spouses just weren't as interested. And so one of them on the last day was like, yeah, I enjoyed the study. My husband said he's glad that I'm not taking pictures of his meals anymore. And so she was somebody who was a little bit less successful. And I kind of wondered, the difference between like kids who are excited to see the box and cook with you versus a spouse who's like, why did you sign up for this? I feel like that efficacy, you might see a difference.
Interesting. So thinking back about your successes and realizing that this study was pretty short term, it was a week and of kind of intense intervention, maybe a little more. Which of the kind of successes do you think are going to be more long term? I don't know if you could project that perfectly or not, but what's your sense here?
I think incorporating family, like kids, into the preparation process is going to be more long term. People tend to have a more kind of passionate viewpoint when it comes to bringing their kids into healthy habits. And a lot of the kids would get really excited with what was in their box, specifically the fruits. The fruits we typically didn't have many issues with. I also think that a lot of like the freezing techniques, so whether that be freezing straight or blanching, will continue to hold with a lot of our participants, just because it's so easy and so many of our fruits can just be frozen as is and thrown into smoothies. A lot of people really liked that kind of easy access to a quick meal that almost feels like a treat. And it's hot like 95% of the year in Louisiana, so.
I agree with the freezing. A lot of people really, not that it seems like it would be common sense that you would freeze something that's going to go bad. But like, you just don't think about it, I guess, unless you have someone kind of working with you, like, okay, what are we going to do with these bananas? What are we going to do with these blueberries? What have you? And so I think the freezing will definitely go forward. People will do that, continue doing that. And another thing I think people will continue doing, because we really worked on it very intensely in counseling sessions, is trying new things, new fruits and vegetables. And if you don't like it, kind of figuring out, what am I going to do with this? Like, if you didn't like some fruit, maybe you can put it in a smoothie with something that has a very strong taste and you can't really taste it too much. If it's a veggie, kind of figuring out how to cook it to have it taste, least pungent, or, to reduce that flavor that they didn't like, or even just repurposing it into, a stock or something like that.
Yeah, we also, talked about prep a lot. And so I think some participants really enjoyed that and started to get a lot of satisfaction from knowing, I have a healthy stew that's ready and waiting. And I had one who, she was very frank about being excited about the cost savings, because she, her kids ate a lot. And so, especially any fruit, she would tell me 2 days after giving her the box, like, they already ate it all, they loved it. And by the end, she was coming to me with like, I made up this recipe, it works so well in my air fryer, just really creative and effective solutions. And so I think that's somebody who enjoyed the intervention and then, really kind of built on it, and is definitely going to carry some of those strategies forward, because they ended up being great for her and her family.
I'm going to go off script here a little bit and ask you a question, because you guys have this incredibly interesting perspective. You've tried to move people on two fronts, food waste and nutrition, and changing those sets of habits have huge implications for sustainability at the household level. So which of those do you think in your group that you've seen was more malleable, maybe more long-term? Were there synergies between them, or did they seem to compete against each other? Just trying to think critically about this space. And I bet Melissa and Gwen might have some ideas as well, but you guys, first tell us.
Yeah, so there weren't too many conflicting situations where counseling somebody on improving their diet quality negatively affected their food waste behaviors. I found it pretty seamless to coincide the two interventions together. There was one session that we focused heavily on food waste, and then there's another session that we focused heavily on improving your diet quality, just because of timing. There wasn't time to cover it all in the first session. But I did find that a lot of my participants, knowing Pennington's reputation around Baton Rouge, really wanted that diet quality aspect. They wanted maybe to lose weight, even though this wasn't a weight loss study. What they know about Pennington is that they offer weight loss studies and things of that nature. So maybe some of those preconceived notions made it a little bit harder for them to focus on the food waste, because they wanted to get to the diet quality piece of things. But most people, when they sat and really thought about their own household and their own behaviors, and when they used the app to record their food waste, that was really insightful for a lot of my participants. And they were able to see, okay, I could improve my food waste, and we're willing to kind of give that space. But I do think that the diet quality pieces will carry on a little bit stronger than the food waste pieces long term.
Yeah, I think so too. I do think, giving them a bunch of fresh fruits and vegetables was competing with having to, preserve that stuff or eat all of it, reduce their food waste. And then we just had to go into counseling on like substitutions, replacements for, what they're currently eating, so they could fit in those fruits and vegetables into their diet.
One thing I thought was funny was that I mentioned the boxes were based on, what was seasonally available. And so at one point, we gave everybody artichokes, and several participants came back and they were like, yeah, from a food waste perspective, I didn't like that because I felt like there were so many leaves and then only like a bite of like actual food in the middle. So like, I don't want to get that again. And so I thought that was kind of interesting because, I don't want to discourage people from eating artichokes. But I did love how like clued in they were, that they were like, no, like this isn't good. There's too much waste.
If I could bring Melissa and Gwen back in as well on what are your thoughts about that interface between trying to change nutrition behaviors and food waste behaviors and kind of the malleability there?
Yeah, that's actually the subject of our recipes project. So I have a lot of thoughts about that. But one of the main things I think they overlap is with portion size. And Gwen talked about a little bit about that with her tips. And so I think that's where the tension can be, because if you don't want to waste food, you might have this desire to overeat a little bit, but some might view overeating as a form of food waste. So that's up for debate. But I think that in general, if we can get people to put less food on their plate, and you can always go back and get seconds if you want it, is going to help with waste and food resource management, as well as with health.
Yeah, just to kind of carry off of that, a lot of it came down to just like those eating behaviors like at consumption time. But there were a few participants that mentioned that reducing their waste went along with their nutrition knowledge. So just like the skins from vegetables, they knew that that's where the majority of the vitamins and minerals were. And so they were adamant about including those into their dishes. And then another participant talked about like with the portion sizing again, that it actually just kind of increase their mindfulness when eating by not just, encouraging the clean your plate club, but more of just having a better connection and mindfulness while eating.
As long as we're at the point of intersections here, thoughts about how the money motivator might be here as well across those dimensions, right? We always worry about, fresh fruits and veg in particular can be costly, and eating healthier might be eating more expensive. Food waste obviously reduces that. What are your sense of that form of messaging might be able to work here? What might not?
Yeah, so for our study, we were using the self-determination theory, which really focuses on intrinsic motivation. So trying to get people to come to enjoy reducing wasting food. And I think some of the dietitians from Pennington spoke to that, like by the end of the study, once you start getting it, you get joy from like no longer wasting. And that's where we want to get people. And so maybe we can pique people's interest in terms of money saving, and especially right now with the high food prices. But research suggests that if to sustain those waste reduction behaviors, we have to shift people. And so by increasing people's competence and teaching them these skills that they need to be able to do it, they can feel better about themselves, and then it kind of pushes people along. So yeah.
Other perspectives, Pennington folks, any thoughts there? Did people think that they were saving money, or did that seem to be a motivator at all for any of your participants?
Well, I guess to backtrack a little bit, we did have a socio economical demographic within our study. About 20%, right around there, were SNAP eligible by Louisiana income standards. And so we did have a lot of participants who were very interested in that money saving piece. And a lot of them were kind of amazed when they looked at their grocery bills at the end of the study, seeing how spending some time ahead to plan helped them to save money when they went to the grocery store. I have one specific participant who really barely had to go grocery shopping at all during her intervention. She had, a couple things that she needed to kind of complete her recipes, and we kind of had worked on that specifically being her intervention target, is using stuff she already had. And she spent very, very little on groceries for the month that we were meeting, and she was so excited about that. She was also more tempted to go get fast food when she was like on the run, and that was another thing we worked on, that she was very grateful because she realized the cost savings that having a little snack prepared was providing her.
Thanks. One question from the chat, and maybe this, would you suggest to make this an equal household task for both men and women? Sounds like this is a focus more of women, different messaging, what might work there? And I know, Mary Catherine, you mentioned one male participant you worked with. Melissa, I don't know if you talked much about your demographics there, but any thoughts on that?
We had more females in the study than males, but we did have some males. And I agree that I think one of the challenges in America is that this historical, like, women-focused role of that food gatekeeper. And from this study and some of the other studies that I'm involved with, it seems like in order to make this work in the busy, chaotic overscheduling that we all are fall victim to, not only do we need to get both sexes involved, but getting children. And I think that's part of like training them to be food conservers, is that it's impossible for one person to do it by themselves. And so whether, it needs to be a household level commitment. And so that's something that I'm particularly interested in moving the needle on in the future as well.
Great. I think we're almost at time. So panelists, any last thoughts about the experience you'd like to share before we sign off?
Just briefly, I found that it was a very interesting process for me to go through as a dietitian, but also personally, I feel like I learned a lot about my own behaviors. And it definitely has made me more passionate about, the food waste problems that we have in America. So it was very, very fascinating and fun to work on.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for participating. I thought this was a great hour. I think we learned a lot. I love some of the ideas that are coming out of this, and hopefully these can all be purposed for future work to develop campaigns that can help forward us both in the nutrition and the food waste fronts. Recipes as a network looks forward to bringing more webinars like this to you over the next several years as our network pushes forward on this very important work. So a round of applause to all of our presenters, and we look forward to seeing many of you in the upcoming weeks and years.